What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? Not just any horse. A creature of impossible stillness, a ghost in a stable that held too many memories. For Leo, this was the question that met him every morning, sharp and cold as the January air. The frost didn't just dust the ground, it bit through the soles of his worn boots. Each crunch on the gravel path to the barn was a sound he'd come to hate. It was a countdown, a reluctant march toward the one living thing that felt more like a monument to his loss than a companion. The stable door groaned, a low, familiar complaint against the wind that swept down from the hills. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old hay, cold leather, and something else, the lingering perfume of her. Clara. It clung to the wooden walls, to the worn saddle blanket draped over a rail, a scent he both craved and recoiled from. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the world had tilted off its axis, and still, her scent was here. He was not. He moved through the dim light, his breath pluming in front of him. His motions were mechanical, a ritual born of necessity, not affection. He filled the water trough, the splash of the hose echoing in the cathedral-like silence. He forked fresh hay into the manger, the rustle of the straw the only conversation in the room. All the while he kept his eyes down, focused on the task, on anything but the presence in the corner stall. But you couldn't ignore her. You couldn't ignore a shadow that breathed. Her name was Solstice, a name Clara had whispered to him on a summer night, full of promise. She was born on the longest day of the year, she'd said, her hand in his, a creature of light. But in the winter of Leo's grief, the horse felt like an eclipse. She was a 17-hand dapple gray, her coat the color of a storm, cloud at dusk, her mane and tail the silver of spun moonlight. She wasn't restless. She wasn't anxious. She simply stood. Her stillness was profound, unnatural. It was a stillness she had been trained for, back when she had another life. A life under bright lights and rolling cameras. A life as a silent star in epic films. Conditioned to stand for hours as battles raged around her, as actors delivered lines that would be remembered for decades. Now, she stood in the quiet dark of a forgotten barn, her only audience a broken man who didn't want her. Leo finished with the hay and finally, reluctantly, let his gaze drift to her stall. She was watching him. She was always watching him. One dark, intelligent eye, framed by impossibly long lashes, followed his every move. Near that eye was a tiny, white scar, a perfect crescent moon shape. A souvenir, Clara had told him, from a stray piece of equipment on a set in Spain. It was the only imperfect thing about her. And it was the thing he always saw first. Today, he had to go in. The latch on her water bucket was loose, and he'd been putting it off for a week. He took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and unhooked the stall door. It swung inward with a soft creak. The air inside the stall was different. It was warm, thick with the scent of the animal herself. A clean, earthy smell of oats and dust, and something wild that no amount of grooming could ever tame. Solstice didn't move as he entered. She didn't flinch or shy away. She just stood, there, a mountain of silent judgment. Her head was high, her ears pricked forward, not with fear but with a kind of clinical curiosity. The space felt small, suffocating with her presence. He could feel the heat radiating from her massive body, could hear the soft rhythmic huff of her breath. He knelt by the bucket, his back to her, fumbling with the metal clasp. His fingers were stiff with cold, clumsy. He could feel her gaze on his neck, a physical pressure. He imagined her muscles tensing, the sheer power coiled in that frame. A horse this size, this powerful, could kill a man with a single, careless kick. The thought was fleeting, detached. He was too tired to be afraid. The clasp finally clicked into place. He stayed there for a moment, kneeling in the sawdust, the smell of pine and horse filling his senses. He didn't want to stand up. He didn't want to turn around. If he didn't move, he wouldn't have to face the silence of the house, the emptiness of the bed, the hollow echo in every room. Here, in the breathing darkness, there was at least a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Without thinking, without meaning to, a sound escaped his lips. A whisper. Clara. It was the first time he'd said her name out loud in weeks. The sound hung in the air, fragile and broken. Behind him, there was a subtle shift. The soft thump of a heavy hoof on the bed of shavings. A slow, deliberate step. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his forehead resting against the cold wood of the stall wall. He waited for a nudge, a snort, some sign of impatience. Nothing came. Instead, he felt a change in the air beside him. A warmth. He opened his eyes and slowly, cautiously turned his head. Soothes had moved. She stood beside him now, her massive head lowered. She wasn't looking at him but at his shoulder. Her nostrils flared, drawing in a long, slow breath. She was smelling his jacket. Clara's old barn jacket, the one he'd pulled on this morning without thinking, the one that still held the faint ghostly trace of her. He froze, every muscle in his body tense. This was the closest she had ever voluntarily been to him. Her breath was a warm, moist cloud against his cheek. He could see the individual silver hairs around her muzzle, the deep, soft darkness of her nostrils. He saw the crescent scar by her eye, and for the first time it didn't look like a flaw. It looked like a tear that had frozen on her cheek. She let out her breath. It wasn't a snort or a huff, but a long, slow, deep exhalation that seemed to come from the very bottom of her lungs. It was the sound of release, a sound of something, finally, letting go. It was the sound he had been trying to make for 3 months. She stood there, her head low, her breath warming the side of his face for what felt like an eternity. She asked for nothing. She offered nothing but her quiet, immense presence. Eventually, the cold seeped back into his bones, and he knew he had to move. He rose slowly, his joints aching. Soothes didn't back away. She simply lifted her head, her dark eye watching him with an expression he couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't affection. It was something older, a deep, quiet knowing. He backed out of the stall, his hand trembling as he slid the bolt home. He felt different, a tiny crack in the ice that had encased his heart. He didn't understand it. This animal, this creature he had resented for being a living reminder of everything he'd lost, had just given him the first moment of peace he'd felt since the funeral. He turned to leave the barn, his boots feeling lighter, on the concrete floor. The wind outside howled, but for the first time it didn't sound like it was mocking him. It just sounded like wind. At the threshold, something made him stop. A feeling. He glanced back over his shoulder. The barn was dim, shafts of pale morning, light cutting through the dusty air. And in the corner stall, Soothes was no longer standing in the shadows. She had walked to the gate, her head hung gracefully over the wooden door, her gaze fixed directly on him. She wasn't just looking. She was waiting. And he didn't know why. But for the first time since Clara was gone, he had the strangest feeling. He wasn't entirely alone. That winter bled into a cold, reluctant spring. The mornings Leo spent in the barn changed, though he couldn't have said exactly when or how. The silence between him and the horse was no longer empty. It was full of a quiet understanding that had no need for words. He started talking. To her. Not in full sentences, just murmurs, fragments of thought that had nowhere else to go. "The pipes are rattling again," he'd say while filling her water. Or, "Looks like rain." Soothes would answer with the soft flick of an ear, a slow blink of her dark eye. It was enough. A strange pattern began to emerge. One afternoon, leaning against the fence, he whispered, "Clara loved the creek this time of year, when the wild mint started to grow." The next morning, he found Soothes not in her stall, but standing at the far end of the pasture, her body perfectly aligned with the tree line, her gaze fixed on the unseen path that led down to the water. She stood like that for an hour, a silent gray statue pointed toward a memory. It unnerved him. It felt like she knew things she had no right to know. Weeks later, he was cleaning out a corner of the tack room. a space cluttered with things Clara had collected. He found an old leather satchel, cracked and stiff with age. He recognized it from a photo as a prop from one of Solstice's films. The moment his fingers brushed the worn leather, a sound came from the stall behind him, a low, soft nicker. It wasn't a sound of greeting or a request for a treat. It was a sound of recognition, a note of a long-forgotten song. He looked from the bag to the horse, and in her eye, he saw a flicker of a life, lived 1,000 miles. Away, a life of dust and lights and commands spoken in a foreign tongue. He was living with a historian who couldn't speak, a keeper of secrets he would never know. The bond between them was a strange, untamable thing. He resisted it. He felt a deep, gnawing guilt in the moments of peace he found while brushing her. Long silver tail, the rhythmic pull and release a kind of meditation. It felt like a betrayal, as if by letting this horse into the cracked spaces of his heart, he was pushing Clara out. He was supposed to be grieving, he was supposed to be lost. He was not supposed to be finding solace in the quiet company of the creature she had left in his care. This horse was his last duty to his wife, not his path to healing. He tried to pull back, to return to the cold mechanical motions of before. But Solstice wouldn't let him. She would rest her heavy head on his shoulder when he was fastening her blanket. She would nudge his pocket with her soft muzzle, not searching for a carrot, but just making contact. These small, insistent gestures were a constant, gentle pressure against the walls he kept trying to rebuild. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday in April. It was time. He couldn't put it off any longer. He had to clean out her tack trunk, Clara's tack trunk. It sat like a sarcophagus in the corner, holding the last remnants of her passion. Opening it felt like a desecration. The smell of leather and horse, shampoo, her smell, rose up and punched the air from his lungs. He sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he lifted out her things, one by one. Her grooming brushes, the bristles still holding a few of Solstice's gray hairs. Her worn riding, gloves shaped to her hands, a bag of peppermint treats now stale. Each object was a new stab of pain. He worked methodically, his breath catching in his throat, a silent, choking grief building behind his ribs. At the very bottom, beneath a folded saddle pad, was a small, cedar box. He didn't recognize it. He lifted the lid. Inside, there were no jewels, no letters. There were photographs. Old faded Polaroids. A much younger Clara, laughing, her face smudged with dirt, standing beside Solstice on a vast, desert movie set. Solstice decked out in ornate battle armor for a film he vaguely remembered them watching together. Another of Clara, asleep in a canvas chair, her head leaned against Solstice's powerful shoulder. The horse was awake, watchful. Behind the photos was a single sheet of notepaper, folded twice. Clara's elegant, looping handwriting filled the page. It wasn't a letter to him. It was a note to herself. He unfolded it. "They want to retire her," it began. "Send her to a sanctuary in Ohio. They say her career is over. But I watch her and I don't think she's finished. It's in her eyes. It's not the blankness of a trained animal. It's a deep, profound quiet. The quiet of someone who has seen great, imagined tragedies and stood firm through all of it. She carries the weight of 1,000 untold stories and asks for nothing in return. She knows how to stand still while the world is exploding. She knows how to wait for the storm to pass." Leo's hands began to shake violently. He read the last lines through a blur of tears. He won't understand at first. He'll think she's just a horse, but one day he'll need her. He'll need someone who knows how to stand with him in the middle of his own storm. Someone who won't flinch at the noise. She will. She'll know what to do. She'll just stay. A sound tore from Leo's throat. A raw, ragged sob that came from the deepest part of his soul. The note fluttered from his fingers. He curled in on himself on the dusty floor of the tack room, and the dam of his grief didn't just break, it disintegrated. It was everything. The loneliness, the anger, the crushing finality of it all, the unfairness, the silence. It all came pouring out in a flood of tears that he couldn't stop, that he no longer wanted to stop. From her stall, Soothes heard him. There was a frantic, heavy scrape of a hoof against the floor, then another. A panicked, anxious sound. Then silence. Leo continued to weep, his body shaking with the force of it. He was vaguely aware of a presence at the stall door. He looked up, his vision swimming. Soothes was standing there, her body pressed tight against the wooden gate. Her ears were soft, her neck was arched, and her great dark eye was fixed on him. There was no fear in it now. Only that deep, quiet, knowing. And as he cried, she stayed. She didn't look away. She didn't move. She just stood her ground, a silent guardian, a patient witness to his storm, just as Clara knew she would. Months passed. Spring softened into the long, warm days of summer. The barn was no longer a tomb, but a place of quiet life. Leo would bring a book and read aloud in a chair beside her stall, the sound of his voice weaving with the buzz of flies and the munching of hay. He found the tiny, weathered leather charm braided deep into her mane, a secret C that Clara had hidden there. He'd leave it, a token of the woman who had somehow managed to care for him even after she was gone. He learned the landscape of her, the way her muscles twitched just before she'd shake her head, the soft, contented sigh she'd give when he found the itchy spot just behind her ears. He was no longer just her caretaker. He was her person. And she, in turn, was his. One evening, as the sun set the sky on fire, he was leaning against her, his cheek pressed into the warmth of her neck. He thought of her past, of the epic stories she had been a part of, always standing silently in the background while heroes fought and lovers wept. Clara was wrong about one thing. Her career wasn't over. It had just begun. Her greatest role was not as a movie horse. It was this: being the still point in his turning world. Sometimes the ones who carry you are the ones no one else saw coming. If this story touched you, subscribe, leave a comment, and press the bell so you can be here for the next story that just might change your heart.